Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. Hope you're well. Wanted to go over some ideas that I think are probably controversial, but in an effort to dispel the myth that if we could only move to a gold standard, or oh my gosh, if we could only move to a Bitcoin standard, that all of our problems would be solved. That this would be some sort of panacea. And I think the both groups are guilty of this, but especially the Bitcoiners. They are really, Bitcoin fixes this, just everything, right? And I think there's also a myth that a lot of the Bitcoin, we'll call them cult members, and this isn't all of them, but a large portion, they perpetuate this myth that money in and of itself is deflationary. They call it deflationary money. No, money is not deflationary. I don't care if you got a set amount of it. I don't care if you have lower amounts of it. What is deflationary is creating more goods and services. If you have just a static money supply and you're not creating more goods and services, you ain't going to get deflation. So, so then I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But now you could argue that, well, you would get more productivity with, stationary money or a fixed money supply. But that in and of itself doesn't mean that the money is creating inflation. And why is that so important? Well, because it allows you to remove yourself if you have been indoctrinated into the cult of Bitcoin or the cult of gold, for that matter. At the end of the day, it's all about people and productivity. So let's get into a couple examples here as to how you can have hyperinflation with gold as money or Bitcoin as money. And again, the reason I'm going over this is so you, as a prudent investor, as a rebel capitalist, you understand that there is no panacea. Well, George, why is this important? Because then you start to understand that there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs, right? And once you understand this, then you realize how important it is to think in terms of probabilities and not certainties. So let's check out a tweet I just did. And we got the screen share on, Josh?
Everything's running fine.
Okay, thanks. So the tweet is, can you have high consumer price inflation using gold, Bitcoin as money? Actually, very easily. And a guy named David Hume, who I think was best buddies with Adam Smith, he illustrated this in this kind of very, very simple model. But back in the day, in the 1700s, this would have been revolutionary, I think, this type of thinking. So Hume illustrates how money supply in a local, money supply in a local arcan. What on earth did I just tweet? Geez, these typos. Okay. Anyway, Hume illustrated how money supply in a local area, that's what I missed, can dramatically increase while global money supply is fixed or limited. And now you can say, George, well, this has an equilibrating mechanism to it. And that is true. But again, my point here is to show that you can have consumer price inflation. And in a moment, I'll show you how you can have hyperinflation while still using gold or Bitcoin as money. So this is the price specie flow mechanism, is what he called it. And again, pretty straightforward, but back then it would have been kind of revolutionary thinking. I don't know why it's blurry, but you've got nation A, nation B, pretty much, exporter, importer, and nation A is exporting more, is as a trade surplus, if you will. Nation B has a trade deficit. So let's just say these are the two parties involved, the only two parties involved globally. then you would have the settlement at the end of the year. So more gold would go to nation A. Well, if gold is money or Bitcoin, whatever, what does that do to the local money supply in nation A? It increases the local money supply. Therefore, prices, as indicated by this red arrow, would most likely, and they might not, but most likely would go up. And then this gives the advantage back to B. And assuming that all the regulations um, and the entrepreneurs and the cultures are all the same, which obviously is a big assumption, then theoretically, the next year or over the next few years, B would get an advantage because their prices would go down because their money supply is decreasing. And therefore, they would have that competitive advantage. So therefore, their import or their exports, excuse me, would then exceed nation A. So again, this is obviously not a perfect model. And in the real world, it's messy. But this shows how you can very easily have consumer price inflation at a local level, even though the global supply of XYZ money is limited and or fixed. Now you say, George, okay, fine. That's just a theoretical example. It doesn't really mean anything. Okay, well, let me be more specific. Let's go back in time, as my buddy Simon Black always says. And I talked about this guy on a live stream. I can't remember whether it was this channel or the George Gammon
You
channel.
talked about it on both.
Did I? Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, super fascinating story. There was this king in Africa, and I think his name was Mansa Musa. And this guy looked like he lived between 1280 and 1337. And he's very well known for being one of, or maybe the first, like, big African king guy to what do you call it when you transfer over to another religion or convert, when you convert to Islam. So what's another interesting fact is when he first converted to this religion, like all or most good is Muslims or people who have incorporated the Islamic faith, what they do is they go on this pilgrimage to Mecca. So it says Musa was a devout Muslim, and complying with one of the Islamic precepts, he began his pilgrimage to Mecca, which made him well known in North Africa and the Middle East. So he made his pilgrimage in 1324. A procession claimed to have included 60,000 men and 12,000 women, each carrying 4-pound bars of gold, silk, gold sculptures, horses, handbags. Basically, this dude was trying to show off how alpha he was. He's like, I'm the alpha dude here, and this is why. Look at all my camels. Look at all my gold. It's kind of the same thing today as guys. I guess I would be guilty of this. Driving around in fancy cars and wearing wearing Hublots. That's just the modern day version of what Musa was doing back with his camels and gold. But anyway, so this pilgrimage, excuse me, took him quite some time. And it says Musa's expedition. Excuse me, I skipped ahead too far here. Musa covered the expenses of the entire procession, feeding the bulk of the people and the animals. 80 camels were also part of the procession, varying reports between them, each carrying 50 to 300 pounds of gold dust. Musa gave the gold to the poor he met along the way. He not only made donations to the cities he passed through on his way to Mecca, including Cairo and Medina, but he also exchanged gold for souvenirs. So he's just being a good guy, a good Samaritan, trying to support the local economy, right? Furthermore, it has been recorded that he built a mosque each and every Friday. Boy, okay, that's some quick construction there. So Musa's expedition was documented by numerous eyewitnesses along the way who were ecstatic at his wealth and grandeur of the procession. There are a wide variety of sources documenting this pilgrimage, including diaries, oral accounts, and histories. Musa is known to have visited this place in Egypt. Okay, got it. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. Musa's generous actions, however, inadvertently devastated the region's economy. In the cities of Cairo, Medina, and Mecca, the sudden influx of gold devalued the metal for the next decade, not the next 10 days, not the next year, the next 10 years. As a consequence, there was a hyperinflation of consumer goods and equipment. To rectify the gold market situation, Musa borrowed all the gold he could carry from the money lenders in Cairo at high interest rates. So he's trying to single-handedly reduce the money supply that he increased that created the hyperinflation to begin with. Josh, does this sound familiar to you, my friend, that last part?
But gold is a fixed supply, George. You can never, ever have inflation.
Right. And that's the moral of the story. You're obviously being sarcastic. But I think what's also interesting is I think there's a strong argument here that Musa tried to play the role of today's central banks. You see where I'm getting that?
Yeah.
Because he increased the money supply and there were unintended consequences. So then he came back in and tried to reduce the money supply, in other words, fix the problem that he created. Again, very similar to today's central banks and politicians, where they are the arsonist and the firefighter all at the same time. We always say history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And boy, oh boy, or maybe in this case, history just flat out repeats. Yeah, or what was the other saying, Josh? Those who don't study history
Are doomed to repeat it or
are
something like
doomed
that.
to repeat it.
Or
Yeah,
like doomed to suffer the consequences.
I think doomed to repeat it. I think that was Churchill or something like that. So the moral of the story here is, like I said at the beginning of the video, do I think it would be superior to have a currency backed by something that the central banks or the commercial banks, for that matter, could not create themselves? Absolutely 100%. But and then, so when I say that, everyone thinks that, oh, okay, great. Well, George, you're a gold bug or you're a Bitcoin or whatever. But then I follow that up by saying that neither, although it may be superior, it doesn't mean that it's perfect. And there are still massive costs that we have to think through. And there will be unintended consequences. And it's never, ever, ever, ever going to be a panacea. And like I always say about Bitcoin, it may be perfect money, but if it's controlled by imperfect human beings, that perfect money will behave in a way that's imperfect, or that perfect money will flat out be imperfect. So a superior money does not fix the human condition. And I think that's what's so important for investors to realize. And therefore, it goes back to what Thomas Sowell teaches us. And this is something, like I was saying at the beginning of the video, you have to always remember, no matter how perfect you think gold is or how perfect you think Bitcoin is, there are no solutions. None. That's not the world we live in. Maybe when you move on to the afterlife, that's how it will be. But it's never going to be that way on Earth. There are only trade-offs. And therefore, you have to train your brain to think in terms of probabilities, never in certainties, regardless of how amazing you think gold is, or Bitcoin, or commodities, or real estate, or whatever you're considering to invest in. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. As always, make sure that you're standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism. I'll see you in the next video.